NewThing is a catalyst for movements of reproducing churches. There are several ways you can get involved. First, we want to begin a conversation with you about how you can plant a reproducing church. You do not want to do this on your own. Let us connect you with others who want to start reproducing churches. NewThing is a place where you can experience a culture of reproduction. Maybe you should do a leadership residency, or possibly you're planning a church. Together, let's start a movement. NewThing wants to help you start your church and the next one and the next one.
Hi, I'm Ed Stetzer. Happy to be here on this NewThing Network resource. And good friends of many years at the NewThing Network, appreciative of the work that you folks are doing. Appreciate the Ferguson brothers, particularly the smarter one, John. And so happy to be able to do this for them and for you. Let's talk a little bit about what I want to frame today is just sort of a 10-step pathway that for you to consider on a journey of church planting. Now, if you're already a church planter, you'll say, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm already done with. Yeah, but I'm hoping you're thinking this way because you're raising up new church planters. And one of the fundamental values, the core values of the NewThing Network is this idea of multiplication over and over again. So this is either you or some multiplication that's related to you. And so I just kind of laid out 10 things that I thought would be helpful in this process. So where does it start? Where does it start when you're going to be a church planter? You may remember, number one is stirring. There's a stirring in your heart for something different. I've heard someone call it a holy dissatisfaction, an angst, if you will. Now that stirring needs to be tempered and wise, because one of the things we know about church planters is they tend to be self-starters and mavericks and, I don't know, this go-get-it kind of people to get it done. And then they can sometimes be difficult to work with, which probably shouldn't shock us because that's what entrepreneurs tend to be, is sometimes a little bit of a challenge. But so if the stirring is just, I don't like the way they do church at my church, that's not necessarily a holy dissatisfaction. That may be an ego dissatisfaction. That may be a dissatisfaction more birthed by your dysfunction than necessarily a stirring from the Lord. So what do you do? Number one is that stirring, right? That stirring, but that leads to number two, some praying. Right, so this is where you begin to temper and consider the stirring. Is God stirring in your heart? Now you consider through prayer. Is God stirring in your heart as you're praying a people in a place among whom to plant a church? I've found that the church planters that often do the best eventually just get a burden for a community. They just say, I got to plant a church in the Ballard district in Seattle. I've just got to plant a church in the south side of Austin. They fall in love with the people as they pray. God gives them a vision, a purpose, a clarity. And this isn't always the case, but I found it to be helpful when it is. Think of Paul when he has the vision of the Macedonian man who says, come over here and help us. As you have a stirring in your heart for a plant, maybe an entrepreneurial angst inside you, the praying should connect that stirring to a people and a place. And as you get to that people and the place, then you begin to consider, am I supposed to go plant a church here? Which leads to the third step on our process, and that's on our journey. It's a 10-step journey. The third is networking. At this point, you need to network on multiple levels. First, if you're in the NewThing network, you're already networking. But if you're not, maybe you're watching this and you're not in the NewThing network, which I think you've stolen this video if you have. But I think the networking, you have to ask the question: have we provided networking in a denominational tradition? A NewThing network, you can actually be in a denomination and the network. But have you built the appropriate networking within the denominational tradition? Are you networking within the pastors of NewThing so that you've got relationships with one another? Here's a few reasons why that's important. First of all, they can affirm or not affirm the call that you've been stirring and praying, right? It's been stirring in you, you've been praying about it. People in your network can say, man, I just don't see it. There's a famous preacher named Charles Spurgeon. He was very, very involved in church planting. A lot of people don't know that. And he'd have these preacher boys, right? So this is London, a while ago. And so he'd have these preacher boys, and they'd kind of come in and pitch him on planting a church in some outlying area of London. And if I recall, Rod Earls did his PhD dissertation on this. I think he planted over 200 churches out of Metropolitan Tabernacle. And so, but they'd come in and they'd sit in his desk, and Spurgeon would sort of sit back in his chair and listen to the pitch and know something about the preacher boy. and he would either give them, thumbs up, not a literal thumbs up, he'd tell them, yes, we'll do this, and suggest a community or maybe receive a suggestion from a community. Or he would sit back and say, son, I just don't see it. Well, you need someone in your life who can say to you, if you want to be a church planter or part of a church planting team or part of a core group, that can say to you, I just don't see it. And that's where networking comes in. If you have no relations, you got stirring and you've been praying, but nobody affirms it, then you might want to go back to the praying and just kind of make sure that that's ultimately God's call. And the networking becomes key later on. If you're in a denomination, you've got some polity where people can speak into your life, some oversight. You want to build relationships with others. That's all part of it. I would also say part of the networking, right? We've talked about networking in a network like NewThing. We've talked about networking with denominations and fellow churches. I'd also network in the community. If you believe that the Lord is calling you to plant a church in St. Paul, Minnesota, you want to probably begin some conversations there. Maybe you're already in an internship, or maybe you're far beyond that, or maybe you're sending out a church planter. Make sure that church planter goes and meets the pastors in the town. Go meet the Methodists and the Baptists and the Pentecostals and the Presbyterians. Go meet the people from the Restoration Movement and the non-denominationals so that you can network inside. Now, is everyone going to be excited? No. But as you're multiplying, you want to make sure that you're seen as a partner who affirms that God is already at work in your community, and it just doesn't show up when you show up. So again, stirring, right? Praying, networking. Fourthly is assessing, right? So stirring, praying, networking, assessing. So assessing, if you're involved and engaged, and now you're multiplying, you're sending people out, this assessment process needs to be key. And probably you don't need to do the assessments if you're the pastor, because you already have an affinity and appreciation for this person you're sending out on a church planting team or a church planting project. So what I would encourage you to consider assessing, to do some pre-assessing. We use the church planter candidate assessment at Lifeway, and you go online, and it's the only really random sample statistically validated tool that's been created like this, that you go through and you sort of do some online testing that maybe says, do you have the characteristics of church planting? Now, if there's an assessment, and this is key if you're a multiplying church, if there's an assessment and everybody makes it through the assessment, you're doing it wrong, right? If there's an assessment and everyone makes it through, it's not an assessment, it's a series of hoops that you have to jump through, but everybody can jump them. Assessment has to screen people out. So assessing includes pre-assessment. Let's say we start with 100% of the people, right? 100% of the people that you want to multiply, or maybe you're the planter, right? You can be different starting points. So if you're 100% of the people, 25% should assess themselves out with the pre-assessment, right? And then you have a more formal assessment. Maybe you sit down, or someone from the NewThing network or a denomination sits down, and they might screen out another 25% of those people. Then you might have a longer assessment, maybe the church planter assessment weekend or a church planting assessment center that you're using, right? So that might screen out. So you might end up with just 25% of the people who started should be planting churches in the way we normally plant churches today. Don't misunderstand. I think people can plant churches, people plant organic churches, simple churches. Thank God for the freedom we have in Christ. When people meet the biblical qualifications of pastor, they can go out and plant a church, even though they might not do it in the entrepreneurial sort of large launch methodologies that these assessments screen for. So again, a pre-assessment, a formal assessment, and ultimately maybe a weekend or a week assessment. By the way, the more resources are going to be invested in the church plant, the higher the level of the assessment should be. And vice versa. If you're putting very little resources in, you just want to say, go for it. Go out and plant a church. Praise God. You got a job at Starbucks. No one's stopping you. You meet the biblical qualifications. We're sending you out. You're blessed. We want to set you apart as a pastor, and let's do this. And so this is how New Testament churches were planted, or historically, how churches in frontier areas or mission stations around the world are planted. So again, going through a list: stirring, praying, networking, assessing. Number 5 is training. Now, training is essential. If you're in the NewThing network, you already know that. But let me just say that if you're about to plant a church, particularly vocationally, and by that I mean it's going to be your job, you're going to raise funds, go out and plant it. A lot of the NewThing churches are that way. If you're going to plant a church vocationally, you're about to throw your whole life into a task that has a pretty decent level of risk, has some challenge, and I would just encourage you to do more training as much as possible. To train in a boot camp, basic training, something like that. When I did my PhD dissertation, I studied 602 church planters, about half of whom all of whom were graduates of a seminary, because I was running a seminary graduate program then. And so all of them were graduates of seminary, or the vast majority, and half of them had gone to a boot camp and half of them had not gone to the boot camp. And so I compared the sample. So now, don't miss this, you've gone to 3 years of seminary. It's supposed to be 3 years, it took me about 5, but anyway. 3 or 4 years of seminary, got a master's in divinity, right? So let's just say 3 and 3. So there's 3 and 3 here. And then these people went to a boot camp or a basic training or a multiple day-long training seminar in church, specifically for church planting. These people did not. After 4 years, there was a substantial numerical difference between these people who had gone to a 3-day boot camp after a 3-year seminary experience than these people who did not. In other words, training is great, but you might be great at preaching, and I hope you are. You might be a great administrator, but church planting is a subset of skills that by and large you don't normally hear or learn in theological education unless you took a track in that. And so therefore training is going to be essential to you. So read some books on these issues. We actually provide some training at newchurches.com. There's training at the NewThing site. There's all kinds of resources for you to get trained well in church planting. But don't stop there, right? So number 6 is coaching. So coaching is going to be key. Now, here's the deal. Years ago when I was writing my dissertation, there was a guy named Joe Hernandez. You'll probably never meet or know Joe, but a few years ago, I actually wrote my PhD dissertation on the development of church planting processes from the mid-90s into the 2000s. And so it's because before 1994, when everyone talked about church planting, maybe before in the 80s, they talk about churches sending out mission committees to start other churches in communities around town. But then what happens, something shifts, and one of the shifts is Joe Hernandez said, I'm going to start using a different kind of language. I actually have a document, all these documents, letters that flew back and forth, people like Bob Logan and others, well-known leaders, Charles Ridley and more. But what Joe said is we're going to insist on not calling this the church planting process. We're going to call this the church planter process. This is not so much about church planting, though it's that. It's not about a mother church sending out people, but it's about church planters. That's going to be the focus of our process and our tools. And when they did that, it reshaped the way people thought about developing church planters. And so, again, coaching became very, very essential to that process. So if things are going well, right, you've had the stirring, you've been praying, you're now networking, you've been assessed, you've gone through a training, some sort of boot camp or a multi-week experience, whatever it is, immediately out of that, you get into the field, you have a coach who's speaking into your life, right? So he or she is asking you questions about your personal journey, right? My experience is most church plants fail because of leadership issues, both either in the leader, in the pastor, in the church planting team, or interpersonal issues, personal issues, or leadership issues. And so now you've got a coach in your life. And again, I can show you the numbers, but you'll have to just trust me on this, that there's a statistically significant difference when someone's in your life relationally in this way. So here's the thing. George Klippanis with the Evangelical Free Church would later use this phrase that I liked and I stole, but I do give credit, as you just heard. He said, no church planter left alone. You heard no child left behind, right? So no church planter left alone. Now, particularly, the NewThing Network is growing and has been successful in planting churches, but it's not that big compared to some denominations, for example. So if you're Assemblies of God church planter, you're going to have a whole bunch of Assemblies of God church plants in Phoenix that you're going to network with. But if you're a NewThing planter and you're going to Phoenix, you need to establish early on how you're going to maintain that coaching relationship. You need to get into some local networking as well. We already addressed that. But coaching is essential, so prioritize it and work through the NewThing system to do that. So again, we're walking through stirring, praying, networking, assessing, training, coaching. Let's talk about learning. Say, well, how's coaching different than learning? Okay, here's how it's different. Everything you learned up until now, which sounded like a great idea, there's an expression in the military, no plan survives initial contact with the enemy. Well, that's true with church planting as well, though they're not the enemy. But no plan. Hopefully when you go through a boot camp, you write out a 18-month prospectus, and you can find examples of that at newchurches.com. We have a whole bunch of them. And so what happens is you get out there, you go to Phoenix, and all of a sudden, Now, how do I build a launch team? Well, how do I develop a core team? How do I plan a launch service? So what happens is there needs to be ongoing learning. So one of the things I'd suggest is that you take a church planning training, then you take the resources with you. And again, I don't want to, let me mention my own book, but there are other books that do similar things. Aubrey Malphur's book does similar things. Is that what we've done is we've structured our book. It's Planting New Churches, and it's now in the second edition, about 50% new content just out in 2016. A NewThing reference, by the way, more than one occasion. What we do in there is that it's set aside so that, okay, now I need to start a Bible study in a neighborhood, chapter 16, right? But you can find that in a lot of resources. So find this so that you're continuing the ongoing learning. This is where I'd suggest, the NewThing gatherings. This is where I'd suggest coming to Exponential, coming to conferences, because there's no better learning than just-in-time learning. And most of the stuff you learned before, you have sort of in the back of your mind, but you won't readily bring to the front of your mind until the need is there and you're reminded of the learning. So I'd say ongoing learning is key. We have a church planting dashboard that we've created that actually enables people, you get newchurch.com, you can find it, that enables people to actually assign learning modules, like coaches to assign learning modules and more, so people can kind of get a picture of how they're doing and through the process of learning more and more. So also would say, this is the time to get in a learning community. So your ongoing learning, reading, reviewing your notes, and your coach is helping you with this. But if you go to Phoenix, right, who are you going to hook up with in Phoenix? Well, you're probably going to hook up with, because there's not 15 NewThing church planners there. You're going to stay connected through coaching the NewThing, but you might get involved in the Converge Church Planning Network that they have in Phoenix. Or if you're in LA, you might be with Together LA or Redeemer Alliance in New York City. So the key is to continue to learn from your coach, take your just-in-time resources that you learned before and review as you go, and then be in a local learning community that helps you to excel in church planning. Okay, number 8. Number 8 is a part that sometimes gets de-emphasized in church planning in more practical networks. NewThing's a very practical and successful network. So sometimes these things, we think of these as more the theological nerds are doing these things, but I want you to know you need to do this too, and that's what we call forming, right? So stirring, praying, networking, assessing, training, coaching, learning, forming. You have to form a church. Now, depending upon your tradition, if you're in the Restoration tradition, if you're an Anglican, part of the NewThing network, there's going to be different kinds of forming. But here's the deal. I asked Elmer Towns once, what's the outside of the leadership failure, I don't mean like a moral failure, but just a failure of leadership, what's the most common reason that church plants struggle? He said, shifting ecclesiology. In other words, you start off and you say, man, we're going to be elder ruled. Then we kind of change our mind, and we're going to be committee led. And then we're going to have an outside oversight team. So what I would say to you is, I think early on you need to plan and work towards, for example, let's use one model of polity. I'm not mispronouncing policy, but that's how churches are structured. Take one kind of polity. It's very common in church planning. Yours may be different. You're an Anglican, you're going to have a bishop. Bishop's going to work with you to set certain things. But just generically, what I would look for is to build a team of elders. I might start with some people who are sort of outside. Maybe a church is overseeing us. Maybe you're right at a community Christian, right? And so that church is your oversight. But you want to get to the place where you raise up elders, right? Early on, you're sort of spotting some of the people who meet the biblical qualifications of eldership. You're kind of speaking into their lives, but you're planning to get to the place where you have elders. Now, elders are not a church. A church is a church. So what else do you need? You need to think about when are we going to partake in the Lord's Supper? Depending on our tradition, a lot of NewThing churches are doing it weekly, and so some are going to be doing it less so. And so when do we take the Lord's Supper? At what point do we begin to take the Lord's Supper? At what point do we form a church covenant where we kind of take a membership class and we're all in this together? Assuming you have membership. Not all denominations do membership. But what I would say is you want to work towards a day. You know, the church I'm planning right now, we actually had a day, and we covenanted as a church, and legally we constituted and incorporated on that day But theologically, what mattered most, we formed a church, and on that day, we signed a charter that we all joke that 50 years from now, then the future pastors we're going to be charter members, saying we're charter members of this church. We're 87 years old, but we chartered, we covenanted together. Our names are on a sheet of paper, saying these are the 4 things. We actually have a list of 4 things in our covenant that we are covenanting with one another. There's lots of subpoints on those 4. We then saw elders in our polity. We actually recommended the church affirmed the elders, and so then you formed a church. Don't think that your church is formed biblically on the first service when people showed up after you sent out a mailer or you did a Facebook ad. No, that's a crowd, but you got to move a crowd into forming into what is really a biblical church. Okay, so that's number 8. Number 9 is developing leaders. Now, part of that's elders going to be developing leaders, but now you got to spend a lot of time transitioning after your church begins into developing leaders. Now, let me explain. There's probably 2 groups of people you need to spend more time with right now if you're planting or pastoring. They are leaders and the lost. You spend more time with the lost, or you continue that evangelistic passion in your church. You can't lead your church to evangelism if you're not doing it. You can't lead what you don't live. Okay, and then leaders, you're going to have to develop leaders who develop systems if you're going to grow your church past 75 people. And again, a lot of resources on that. Look at Bill O'Sullivan's Breaking the 200 Barrier. I've got a seminar called Breaking the 200 Barrier you can find as well. And so breaking those barriers grows your church. And then lastly is multiplying. We want to get to multiplication, right? So then the cycle begins again. Now maybe you came in and you were at number 8. You're at the forming stage, right? You're like, well, is everything 1 through 7 not for me? No, you bet it's for you, because you're going to multiply, and you're going to need to sit down with some people who are stirring, and then they're praying, then they're networking. And so this becomes a cycle, right? David Hesselgrave, famous missiologist, writes about the Pauline cycle, the cycle we see in Paul, how he sort of goes through this process of evangelizing, raising up leaders, appointing elders, and it's a cycle. Well, if we're going to get to church planting in North America that's truly movemental, that's what we're increasingly calling level 5, it's going to be that we walk a cycle, and that cycle starts again, and that cycle starts again. I'm thankful for what's going on at NewThing. Great stuff. Continue to provoke one another to love and good deeds, as the writer of Hebrews says, and I hope these 10 things might be in some way a help to you to continue that cycle of multiplication.